Dave Tippett's out. Jay Woodcroft is in. What do you think Jay Woodcroft can bring that Dave Tippett didn't bring?
Good question. Well, there's always a spike when you bring another coach in. The players want to show the new coach that a new voice and such will be heard, and that they will put forth a better all-around effort. He's younger than Dave Tippett. Dave Tippett has won 648 NHL games, and Jay has won none as the head coach. So that's obviously a difference. It's always a tricky thing when you bring up the farm team coach, because the farm team coach has a affiliation with a lot of the players he coached in the minors, of which you're looking at Kyler Yamamoto, and you're looking at Tyler Benson and Ryan McLeod, and on defense, Niemelainen and Lagesson and those sort of games. You were always wondering, okay, now is he suddenly going to have them play a whole lot more minutes because he coached them in the minors at the expense of the NHL players? And the other side is he's been an assistant coach for the Oilers before, when Leon was here, and when Connor was here, and when Ryan Nugent-Hopkins was here. So how do they relate to a guy who was formerly the assistant coach now that he's the head coach? And I think it's always a very tricky dynamic. The assistant coach is usually the good cop. The head coach is the sterner, I make the decisions kind of guy. So I think it's a tricky dynamic for Jay Woodcroft here. He was the assistant, so he knows the players that he had in Bakersfield, but he can't just give them jobs because he knows them from Bakersfield. And, he can't just give them more minutes. And with the veteran guys, they know him as an assistant coach, but now they have to listen to him a little more often than they did before when he was, now that he's the head coach.
The Oilers could have brought in a veteran coach again. There are coaches out there that are available with NHL experience. And, the Oilers are coming off like 3 straight experienced coaches. But they go with the new voice. Obviously we're talking about years. Todd McClellan is 2015. We're talking 7 years here with 3 very veteran coaches. And now you're going with Jay Woodcroft in hopes that you can turn this season around and get them into the playoffs. We look at what the Canucks did, firing Travis Green, bringing in a veteran coach in Bruce Boudreau, and that did kickstart them into the hunt since they were, listless there. Is rolling the dice with a young coach, is that a risk?
I guess it could be. Ken Holland says he didn't ask Mike Babcock to coach the team. Well, obviously they have a history in Detroit, and Mike is a pretty stern taskmaster as a head coach. Now, that doesn't say that, in the summer he might go back to Mike Babcock when his University of Saskatchewan duties are over as head coach, and if Jay, isn't successful, in his 38 games to get the Oilers in the playoffs and make a little news in the playoffs, that he might go back to a more veteran coach. I don't have a problem with it, to be honest. It's the middle of the season. Most of the players in the team know who he is. He's not going to have to introduce himself to too many people other than Evander Kane and maybe Zach Hyman and such, but not too many guys he's going to have to introduce him to. He was here before as an assistant coach, so I don't have a problem with it. We use it all the time, and every time a coach gets fired, the general manager says, I think they just needed a different voice. I hate that. Is a different voice going to really make that much difference? I don't think so, unless the team is tuned out the previous guy. I don't think the team tuned out Dave Tippett. I don't think they stopped playing. So a different voice, in this case with Jay Woodcroft, I don't think it's that big a deal. But that's the standard cliche. I think they needed a different voice.
You could say that's what happened in Vancouver. They got Bruce Boudreau in there, different voice. And, they obviously pulled themselves back into a...
I think it's how the guy coaches more than the different voice, I guess is what I want to say. How is he going to come in here and change things? Is he going to... It's a tricky dynamic between you're coaching the minor league team, okay, with all those players who want to get their dream achieve to get to the National Hockey League. They are counting on the coach in the minors coaching them up, okay? So they get to the National Hockey League. They are beholding to the coach in the minors, I think, in a way, to play them enough that they can show enough to get to the National Hockey League. When a player, a coach moves to the NHL with veteran players, if he keeps his job, it'll be because of Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl and Darnell Nurse and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. More veteran players. I think he has to come in. I think he's a smart coach. I think he has to see that the team gives up too many quality chances. I think they hang their goalies out to dry. The last couple of games, certainly Mike Smith before the New York Islander game. Too many glorious chances to score goals on a guy who hadn't played in a month. You'd think they'd tighten it up a little bit.
We're going to find out here over time whether we can talk about whether this is more on the coaching or whether it's more on the players or how this team is put together. And those really are the three factors, looking at, is it on the players? Is it more on the coaching? Is it more on the general manager and who he decided to bring in to form this roster? When it comes to hockey, when it comes to sports in general, all the ingredients that make up a roster and what makes it work and doesn't work. I mean, those are all, questions we'd all like the answers to. If it was that easy, we'd just press a button. The difference being, we have McDavid and Draisaitl, two of the best players in the league, if not the world, playing on this team.
It is. I think, as you pointed out, I think it's a three-headed monster here. I mean, obviously, the coach has a large bearing in how a team plays. He makes up the game plans and he plays the players he thinks in terms of minutes and where he figures they would best fit. And the general manager puts the team together. In Ken Holland's case, he hasn't gone out to get them a number one goaltender who can play a whole pile of games and is 26 or 27 years old. He tried for Jacob Markstrom, Calgary got him. He tried for Darcy Kemper last summer, Colorado got him. It's not like he hasn't tried, but he didn't. So he's on record and knows that he's as much at fault here for where the team is. But I know the fan doesn't want to hear this, but eventually it's the player's responsibility. They can't run through so many coaches here and it's always the coach or it's always the general manager putting the team together. Eventually the player has to say, well, what about me? Maybe it's me. Maybe it's us as a team. Maybe we just don't, do the things they want us to do on a regular basis. So I think the players are every bit as culpable for where the Oilers are in the standings as the coach and the general manager. And the players have to take ownership of that. The leadership group has to take ownership of that. And they have to get out of this. They have to get mad. They have to say, okay, if we have to play 2-1 games and 3-2 games and it looks boring, so be it.
This isn't the first time the Oilers have gone with an interim coach mid-season. We saw it in 2014-15 with Todd Nelson coming up from the Oklahoma City Barons at the time, the predecessor to the Condors, to take over from Dallas Eakins, who, and that's a totally different era, a totally different team. I mean, that was leading up to 2015 draft, the lottery, which changed absolutely everything when it comes to the trajectory of this team. How did that go with Todd Nelson? I mean, it's a different team. I mean, the Oilers were not a playoff team, even with, it had Taylor Hall and Jordan Eberle and the like there. But, it's different when you have, what the Oilers did drafting McDavid. I mean, Draisaitl became a regular on the roster after that era. And all the coaches they've had since then, obviously two different general managers trying to put together a roster to complement McDavid, Draisaitl, and the like. Anyway, but going back to Todd Nelson, how did that, I guess what I'm asking is, how did that go? I don't know if there's anything to learn from that.
Todd was a good coach.
It seems like ancient history. It's 7 years ago.
Yep, and Todd, I think it was a little different story. He was replacing Dallas Eakins, who'd never been a head coach in the NHL before. He wasn't replacing a guy
right
like, Dave Tippett with 648 career wins, top 20 all time, or Ken Hitchcock with over 800. And Todd McClellan with over 500. He was replacing a guy who coached 113 NHL games. But at the end of the season, Todd McClellan was available, and they hired a veteran, Todd McClellan and Todd Nelson. He was a substitute teacher till the end of the year. Then they went with somebody with more tenure in the NHL and hired Todd McClellan, who's a good coach and has done a nice job in LA this year. So it is a different story. I guess, the semi-parallel is back in Todd Nelson's case. They had the three offensive guys with Taylor Hall and Jordan Eberle and Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, who were really good young players and kind of were the stars in the team. Now it's McDavid and Draisaitl and still Nugent-Hopkins. But obviously Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl are a cut above.
One challenge Woodcroft has, and he addressed it during his availability with the media, is that there's not a lot of time for practice. You've got a game every second day. In a perfect world, you'd have like that All-Star break to bring some guys up to speed when you had some time. You don't have necessarily maybe a break where you have 2-3 days off between games. You don't. So obviously that's just something he has to deal with, and that's what he said. He's like, well, that's just the hand I'm dealt. I'll just have to deal with it. But I can't help but think that it might work against you a little bit.
Well, it might. Certainly it's different than the American Hockey League, especially in the division he's in the Pacific in California, where they only play on the weekends, basically. So you play, every now and then you'll have a Wednesday game, but basically you play Friday or Saturday or Sunday, and then you have 5-6 days off to practice to play again. It's not that way in the NHL right now. Certainly not with 40 games in the last 81 days. They will be playing almost every second day.